Recording. All right, there we go. Welcome everybody. And in the spirit of the video that we have just seen, we are now discussing a very important topic in a very important conversation around leadership, around public leadership and the leadership we need. And it's part of the series at the Nelson Mandela School of Thinking about leadership in governance. And in particular, this session will be looking at corruption, which is the center of the democratic challenge. So I'd like to welcome everybody in the room and everybody online as well. We hope that everybody who's online can hear us well. We'll try to project our voices as much as possible. And I'd also like to recognize all the colleagues of the Mandela School at the school, particularly our director, Professor Ferial, who has been guiding the vision of the school and has guided us to this point of really thinking about this question of leadership, particularly when it comes to the nexus between governance and development. So my name is Dr. Mandela, and I'm responsible for the academic program at the Nelson Mandela School. I also teach in the area of political economy, particularly focusing on policy making broadly, of course, focusing on questions of the state, the nexus between the state and the private sector as well. And I think that I'm sitting here precisely because of my research interest in the nexus between what the state does and what the private sector does. And I think this conversation takes us into that direction. It's an important conversation, not just because of the substance that we'll be covering today. It's also about what the school intends to do with it. We are actually trying to build from these conversations new insights and new understandings about the role of leadership in governance. I think that we have seen over the past decade or so, particularly in South Africa, but also in the broader African continent, gaps in leadership. And so it is no longer sufficient to just talk about governance broadly, talking about institutions broadly. We also need to understand this role of leadership in order for us to actually better understand what we mean by governance and what we mean by institutions and how those work together in this quest for progress, for human progress, in this quest for development. And that's what we are trying to tease out here. We know that things go wrong in our journey of building robust institutions and robust governance systems. Things go wrong in the sense that we now have experienced over the past couple of years rampant corruption in South Africa and in several places in the continent, and also state capture as well. How do we think about those empirical events beyond just them being empirical events and beyond just, the history and thinking about these things as path dependence? Is there some agency? Is there some current agency that has a role in that? So we want to think about these kinds of questions. The Nelson Mandela School at the University of Cape Town is about building the next generation of ethical leadership in the African continent. That's who we are. And when we're talking about the next generation, that is perpetual. At any point, at any given point in time, the Mandela School ought to be found building the next generation of ethical leaders in Africa. And for that to happen, we ourselves need to have a very critical understanding of what we mean by leadership. We believe in knowledge as having a trigonometry. There are points in the way where we know we've built enough knowledge, we've built enough insights where we can comment and teach about leadership, we can teach about governance and institutions. But at that very point, new questions arise, given the limits of our knowledge. And so that's where we are now. We are in a journey of discovering, in a journey of questioning, again, in order to build up an analytical framework that can better explain the problems that persist. I think that life continues because we still have problems to solve. We still have these challenges. And so we don't understand enough and we don't know enough. And so that's what we're trying to build in this leadership series broadly. And of course, the question of corruption is vitally important. Okay, so I've explained that this series on leadership falls in this nexus between governance and development. Broadly, just to say that what we understand about governance are the different structures, the different arrangements and agreements that are in society on governing over different resources, different localities, goals and aspirations, right? And it consists of institutions, and that's why it would be important to talk about corruption, because what's the role of corruption on the resilience and the robustness of institutions? It also talks about power, the configuration of power, the distribution of power, and precisely how that power is used in ways that advance progress, or used in ways that are predatory, that are corrosive, and lead to parts of corruption and state capture. And so that's what we are doing here. We are also particularly interested in this conversation around the arena of action, what has been happening in practice, the stories, the anecdotes. And I think that's important, and as I'll be introducing our speakers shortly, that's what we want to leverage, right? The immense knowledge, the immense data that has come out, you know, of the Zondo Commission in South Africa, for an example, and of the different, you know, investigations that have been recorded over time. And we want to draw from that towards building an understanding and towards building a new analytical framework. This analytical framework should not just build understanding and explain. It should be usable for policymaking and for action, essentially, because ultimately we want to bring about change. And I think that it's appropriate now to then introduce our speakers, because our speakers bring this empirical knowledge and this insight because you have followed that. And our first speaker is renowned award-winning journalist Ferial Haffajee. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm just going to read the biographies of the speakers, starting with you. So Ferial Haffajee is a multi-award-winning South African editor and journalist, and a global moderator, as well as a regular speaker and analyst. She is an associate editor at the leading news site Daily Maverick. I think all of us know Daily Maverick, which is widely recognized as one of the world's leading media innovators. Previously, she was editor-in-chief at the Mail and Guardian and City Press, also very known, at least in South Africa, working with teams who have won numerous investigative and other journalism awards. She is a regular analyst and commentator on radio, television, and elsewhere. One of the roles she enjoys most is as a global moderator, largely with the African Leadership Initiative, a partner of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. She is a fellow of the African Leadership Initiative, a network of enlightened leaders who do extraordinary work on the advisory board of the Open Society's Program for Independent Journalism, and has previously been a board member of the World Editors Forum and the Global Editors Network. Ferial has won numerous awards for journalism and for support of media freedom, including in 2013, including a committee of the Projection of Journalism International Press Freedom Hero Award in 2015, and a Netflix Phil Weber Award in 2013, the global tech company's highest internal honor. Previously, Ferial was chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum and chairperson of the CNN Multi-Choice African Journalist of the Year Awards. She is studying a book called What If There Were No Whites in South Africa, which was actually partly launched here at the Nelson Mandela School in 2016. And in 2017 was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of the Free State. In 2022, Ferial published a book on corruption and state capture, Days of Zondo. The book draws on the key findings that emerged from the Zondo Commission into state capture in South Africa. And this is the book, which is quite riveting. For those of you who haven't bought it, it's something worth reading indeed. So we'll be hopefully drawing from those insights as well. So welcome, Ferial indeed. And we have our second speaker, Advocate Gary Pienaar. Welcome, Advocate. So Advocate Gary Pienaar was until recently a senior research manager in the Developmental, Capable and Ethical State, the DCES Research Division of the Human Sciences Research Council, or the HSRC. He is recently a research associate with the DCES. He holds an MPhil in Values and Policy Studies from the University of Stellenbosch and a BA Honours LLB from the University of the Witwatersrand. His work at the HSRC has focused predominantly on constitutional law and human rights, public governance, corruption and ethics, corruption and ethics, democratic participation, transparency and accountability, and evaluations, in which areas he has extensive qualitative experience, particularly in discourse analysis. After leading the development of the HSRC's Transformative Governance Index, which aims to encourage and facilitate the faster realization of socio-economic rights, he jointly led the development of a scorecard to assess South Africa's compliance with the African Union's Convention to Prevent and Combat Corruption. He is part of the team within the HSRC that has been collaborating with the Zondo Commission to track the government's implementation of the extensive reforms that were recommended to prevent corruption and a recurrence of state capture. Government and Parliament published response plans in late 2022. He is currently co-lead of a study exploring anti-corruption social norms and values to support the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. Advocate Gary, welcome as well. Thank you. And do we have our third speaker, Hidayat Hassan, yet? Not yet. Okay, so she might join later. And I think at the point of joining, if she manages to, then I'll read her biography as well. So the nature of the session is to be an informal conversation, really. So that each of us can feel free to really share our experiences and to share our thoughts about this very important question. South Africa is ours, the continent is ours, and we have to have a collective sense of ownership around these problems that we are facing. And so how the session is structured is that until about 2:30 to 3:45, we'll be fielding some questions and discussing some questions. And these questions are broadly divided into three. We have what questions, we'll be thinking about some definitions, some causes, and some enabling conditions in relation to state capture and corruption. And then we'll talk about the who and the why in the story of corruption. And then we want to also talk about the how in relation to both how corruption happens, but also how to rebuild and reform as well. And then at that point, at a certain point, we'll then invite everybody to come with their comments and with their questions. For those of you that are online, you can feel free to also use the chat room to write out your questions, and then we'll be tracking those questions as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to start with the first question, and I'm going to address it mainly to you, Ferial, which is there a difference between state capture and corruption? And if there is, how is this difference useful from an analytic and policymaking perspective?
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be with you all back at school again and meet this beautiful home, but it's nice to be here. So thank you very much for asking that, because in the initial questions which were sent, there was no distinction drawn between corruption and state capture. So corruption, as I understand it, is of course using your office, your power to get a gain. And we have become, I would argue, fairly corrupt. If you look at the work of Corruption Watch, this happens mostly at local level. That's the main kind of report backs they get. It's school bodies, it's where power is abused, but at quite a local level is where people seem to feel it most intently in their lives. The animal that we've come to understand and study as state capture is entirely different, and I suppose more apposite for the school of government. This is where governance is misappropriated, but also reshaped for the purposes of extraction, rent extraction, and for corrupt purposes. And that is what we've come to call state capture. That is the definition that the Zondo Commission of Inquiry worked with, along with Harvard scholars, but it's the repurposing of the state and state institutions, like the state-owned enterprises, mostly of Eskom and Transnet, and we can see the impacts of that still today. We feel very acutely. Port of Cape Town, for example, definitely regular load shedding. It changes the nature of statecraft, state purpose fundamentally.
Right. That's very useful, because you also you bring in the elements of the different levels as well. Corruption, you're saying that it's rampant. Mostly we see it at the local level, and then with state capture, it seems like there's an element of size here as well, in terms of, you know, state-owned enterprises, national government. Does it flow all the way as well?
So just to give you an anecdote, to give you a sense of how it was planned and plotted. The Gupta family was, of course, at the story of the center of state capture as we knew it. So what I think it was Ajay Gupta, he was like the brains of the family, whereas you might call Atul Gupta the business development manager. He was the guy that went out and got the contract, got to know the politicians. Far more charming chap. Yeah? So Ajay far less charming, and I've made photos of both of them, some authority. He would literally sit with the whiteboard and scope out where the biggest contracts in the state were going to. And so they started playing at the GCIS by the formation of the new age, their own. So the first thing you need to do is to begin to get hold of a mass media. Remember, this was before social media became so preponderant. So you get hold of some way in which you can push your propaganda, your ideas, and their people. But very soon thereafter, he worked out, and I remember Nazim Ahawa, who was the CEO, I went to breakfast at their house one day. He said that coal sales to Eskom was where the big money was. So it was literally seeing where state spending happening, and how can they apply a propaganda model, which is the white monopoly capitalism idea that Bell Pottinger used so effectively, and then you begin to work out what do you need to do to direct those capital transfers toward your own enrichment.
Right. So it's actually quite well thought out.
Very
as a system. I think it's scary just to bring you in this, in relation to corruption and in relation of what Ferial has just said. Is corruption also systemic? Is corruption cultural? What's the root of corruption?
I don't think there's a single root as a start. I think we live in an ecosystem. In fact, we live in a society that is a set of overlapping ecosystems. The Communist Party originally identified state capture as the private sector capture of the state. But then it became evident that the private sector was, different parts of the private sector were playing different kinds of roles. So, as Ferial has mentioned, there were a private family who had a business. But there were also other individuals from the private sector who acted as fronts, or you had professionals acting as facilitators or enablers. So I don't think there's a single route. Some of the research that we've been doing at the HSRC, a number of different projects, one looks at state capacity, and we're looking at the fiscal administrative interface. And there is a space where the executive authorities, so the politicians and the administrators, interact to, first of all, develop and then implement state policy or government policy. Now, that is not a well-regulated interface, and instructions are given or implied, and action is taken to repurpose the state or to extract rents, as Ferial has mentioned. I think the corruption is also a very personal level issue of values.
Right.
So our constitution looks at society as in need of dramatic change. As we've moved, as we've transitioned from apartheid and colonialism to democracy, we need to change the way we think about who we are,
Right.
and how we relate to each other, and where we want to go as a country.
Yeah.
What is the new form that we want to take on? And the constitutional values of dignity and equality, for example, one would hope that that's what leaders take on.
Right.
But one would expect individuals to know that that is our new national mission.
Right.
And it isn't.
Right.
Very often, capitalism has become our new personal mission. And the materialism that entails, and the conspicuous display of wealth and self-aggrandizement in various ways, whether they be social, economic, might be ways in which corruption is expressed. So we've also seen that from research we're doing on social attitudes and social values, power dynamics, whether they be related to politics or business, so financial power, or social power, can make a difference. So individuals, so this is some emerging research, it's not final yet, so I would just ask folks to take this with a pinch of salt. We haven't yet completed the research, but it seems as though there is a greater degree of tolerance of corruption. If one feels one of two things, either invulnerable to its consequences, or potentially very, very vulnerable to its consequences. So if you feel that you're going to get away with it, you happily engage in it. If you've got political or protection, for example, or you think you can buy your way on the trouble through half-decent lawyers. But if you're very vulnerable, you're also less likely to stand up against corruption, to report corruption, even among your family or your neighbors, because you are left in a situation by the state that has not yet meeting its social contract with the people in terms of our transformative constitution. So we still have massive inequalities and the vulnerabilities that come with that. And I think so people we're seeing from public opinion research are feeling like they don't stand up against corruption because it might come back to bite me. I might need help from my neighbor next week because my life is so precarious that I need this social network. So I think corruption can take a variety of ways. It can be on that state level, it can be on a very individual personal level, and I think our socioeconomic and our socio-political circumstances have eaten away at our social fabric, so that our values are changing. Sometimes by dint of necessity, and sometimes by dint of or for reasons of opportunity.
That's very interesting, and I think building on that, we just said that we built an institution, a constitution in South Africa that has foregrounded the values and the norms of human dignity and human progress. And that's the mission, that ought to be the mission. And now we have moved into a place where there is now corruption at the personal level and also at the state level, more broadly, even to the other non-state actors. Ferial, what have been the enabling conditions that we have seen, perhaps at least in the past 30 years or so?
So this is why I so love the questions and the concept note. I think there's a whole step missing in the analysis that we have to start getting to if we're going to understand or indeed mix this piece. And these are really big questions. It is colonialism, apartheid, inequality. It's those big questions. And I'll come to the cultural explanations, which I heard at the Zondo Commission found very interesting. So a couple of years ago, Mac Maharaj asked me to speak at the launch of his book Breakthrough with Zed Palo Jordan. And it was a defense of the constitutional settlement because Mac was getting extremely concerned that the next generation of people, perhaps exemplified by your fees must fall generation, regarded the negotiated settlement as a complete whitewash and a sellout. And what Mac was trying to do there, so you had Dr. Stembele Mbeki speaking, Asiya Hassan, a couple of other young people, and they very much pronounced on that view that this constitution was a sellout, that life circumstances for Black people hadn't been altered at all, and that the economic transformation hadn't taken place. Mac then said that the constitution was only ever meant to be a starting, not an end. So land expropriation was specifically permitted in. We were supposed to change the roots of the apartheid capitalist complex. We didn't do that. In fact, what you see is financialization of the economy near complete at the same time as deindustrialization. And so who are the big dogs? How do we read about these corporate salaries? Did you see that some is a really great guy from Standard Bank, he took home some astronomical amount of money last year. Neil Froneman, 83 million rand.
Yeah.
So state capture occurs in this milieu of the kind of capitalism which we've built. And you absolutely cannot get away from that. Until we don't change the one thing, we don't change the other thing. I'll tell you a story. So at City Press, we uncovered in Kandla, and then we did Julius Malema and these first peccadillos in Limpopo. We were constantly uncovering and criticized for only uncovering Black corruption, but not white. And the subtext of that was that we were also refusing to countenance Black accumulation, what you here would call the formation of a Black capitalist class, when after all the Land Act, colonialism, apartheid had been the wholesale extraction of Black assets by white people. And that what we weren't doing was seeing that it was necessary, no matter the means, for Black people to accumulate at a pace to make up for the centuries that had gone before. I didn't know then, I still don't know how to respond to it. And my response then, which was, but our constitution demands something different of leaders. We shouldn't be so self-. But yet the structure continued to reflect those historical patterns.
Yes.
And I think we have work to do at the macro level.
Yeah.
I thought that the cultural explanations by the ANC in the course of the Zondo Commission were extremely interesting, Musa. So Gwede Mantashe, when named as one of the people for further investigation and possible prosecution, the ANC Secretary General, now Minister of Mining, he said he had received lots of goodies from Bosasa and around that. So he said that these were bonds of kinship and Ubuntu, which white advocates, read Paul Pretorius was asking, was interrogating him, couldn't possibly understand. Nombula Mokonyane, also a minister and now the Deputy Secretary General, she said that all the things she had received from Bosasa were gifts from friends and comradely whites, that is the Watsons, who understood African culture, understood this. Zizi Kodwa, who loved staying in a very expensive house belonging to EOH in Fresno with the chef on hand. I believe that's how they do things in Fresno, or maybe not. He said that these were gifts from friends in the course of political life. You need a certain way. So this was all poppycock. But imagine now that actually I think the logic of that cultural explanation has won out, because all of the people in the ANC named by the commission as and in rigorous investigation, checked by Terence Nombembe and his investigative team, everything they said had been investigated and corroborated and sworn to. So this is not just investigative journalism, it's of a rigor.
Yeah.
So the logic of capture has prevailed, because all of the people named, most of them, they're on the list of the ANC. Mandela is heading this election. I think what you're going to see happening is that President Cyril Ramaphosa will maybe get in and be able to form a government, certainly not with the majority, but with a high enough percentage to be able to form the coalition government. But then very quickly he'll be replaced. And what you'll see there is a vanquishing of the notion of ANC renewal and a victory of the form of accumulation, which I've tried to outline here.
That's very scary, because it just says a lot around, the vested interest in this direction of accumulation.
Maybe wrong, but I think that's the direction it's going to lead. It's why we haven't seen a single successful state capture case of a significant political personality, and I can't see that happening.
Right. Sure, that's very scary.
It's going to be a downer, but I'm studying the government.
You have. We need a bit more of that, and I think that please bring that in. I will tease you a bit more as we go with that. But maybe just to come back to you, Advocate Gary. So we see this idea that, as Ferial has shared, where, corruption and state capture has been legitimized through all these sorts of narratives, which are, definitely untrue, blatantly untrue. Going back to the Constitution and the norms and the values, and then the explanations of these enabling conditions that we've seen, is it the case that the counterfactual, if South Africa, from the point of 1994, if it had gone on a path of growth and on a path of broad development, would we have seen an upholding of these constitutional values, or would we have still seen the corruption that we've seen? And I'm trying to reconcile with what Ferial just said around the economic conditions that lead to this deterioration.
I recall President Mbeki talking about the two-tier society. And clearly he was speaking at a time of economic growth, and that division was becoming embedded in the structure of our society. It was not being ameliorated, it was being elevated. And so the path of development or capitalist development is not necessarily what the Constitution envisages. As Ferial has indicated, there was an element of redistribution, but there also needs to be an element of pre-distribution. So you need a network, a social security network for those who not going to immediately fit into this growth economy because of the deprivations of the past and the disadvantages that people still live with. But there also needs to be we were born as a country at a time of expansive globalization. And that was the dominant narrative, and it was a triumphalism of the West, and so on. Very difficult to resist all of that, and the money that comes with that. And so, and therefore the policy influence that comes with that too. But the other instruments in the toolbox of the Constitution were just not used. So the social safety net, the redistribution of land, the deliberate attempts were needed to restructure our society, to help people to get even to the starting line, to be able to compete equally. Those steps were not taken. So, I mean, I think not just in terms of policy or the way in which the law was not used in its intended way, the Constitution, but I think also the way in which the party understood its role in society. And it saw itself as above the Constitution. I think that's become increasingly clear that the Constitution is not the supreme law of the land or the supreme source of power, but the party is. And I think the other concern is that democracy education hasn't really happened at a deep level. And so I think one can talk about nepotism in your family business as entirely acceptable and it's not okay in the state. Because in the family business, you are doing it for the family. and then you have a limited set of obligations and your reach and your goals are constrained by that vision.
Yes.
In the state, nepotism is not acceptable.
Yeah.
In the states, which is not appropriate.
Right.
There you have a code of ethics, you have several codes of ethics. If you wear several hats like a member of parliament and a minister, you have a number of codes of ethics and you have to declare gifts of any value in return for which your opinion might be swayed.
Right.
So I think that level of democratic education didn't really happen either for the elite or for the average citizen.
Right.
So that they could see a clear distinction about the way in which business or operations are conducted in these different spheres of society.
Right.
Ferial wants to.
Yeah.
Oh, nature of our piece in a way is that we say, oh, these norms of the private world, the white world, if you like, are one thing and they're untouchable. But in the state world, regarded as the black world, we apply a different set of ethics and modes of being. And for me, I've learned as Chris, Madam Guardian, everywhere I work, is that binary, that double standard will get us into more trouble.
I would agree with you in large parts, but I would take the opportunity to share a personal story.
One that family. Still what is the family?
So two things. One is a little anecdote from my wife, who works in the medical industry, and there, the practice of taking somebody out to lunch or sending them on an overseas study trip or whatever, paying for them to go to a conference, can't happen. Supposedly, there are those who try and do it, but there are now a number of ethical rules that say you cannot do that anymore to make things fairer in that competitive space.
Right.
I think also the ethics in the larger society are. I think we've lost the reason for our ethics. So I think there's a valid reason for Ubuntu, and there was a way in which it is reflected in the Constitution, and redistribution and pre-distribution is a way of expressing Ubuntu.
Yeah.
But it's not going to work unless our attitudes change. So if we don't treat each other with dignity and respect, throwing money at a situation is not going to change it.
Yeah.
And there is that process of self-reflection. I think we can see it in our politics today between black and white. It's still not happening. In fact, we've become, I think Ferial was right to describe the politics as the black world and business as the white world in other respects.
Yeah.
There was an effort to integrate us in government.
Yes.
There has been an effort to integrate us in business. But unfortunately, that's unraveling, it seems to me, and we're retreating to our caps.
Right.
And business is, there's black and white business, and do they do much business with each other only if they're forced to?
Yes.
And very often it's not for value exchange. And that has led to misconceptions. And I'm thinking of the construction mafia as an example, where BEE had a laudable objective. Tender deployment happens in every government around the world, but both of those ideas have been misused and abused in South Africa, so that the power is misused for personal or fractional gain, rather than to achieve transformative development in general.
Right. I think those are very useful because now we're seeing the role of history, we're seeing, the role of ethics at the personal level all the way to the state level. And we've also talked about, of course, the politics, the complex politics in South Africa. But we also have to talk about agency as well. And agency in the sense that beyond the history that we have and we're still grappling with, and the issues that we're grappling with that are covered very well in the Dave's genre. Let's think about the stories now, shifts to the stories on who was involved and why, and still bring back this why. It's this what happened and why. So who has been committing these acts of corruption? And in other words, has it been specific personalities? Is this what it's about when we're talking about grand corruption in the country? Or, you know, is it types of individuals so we can systematize the categories of types of individuals, or is it groups, or is it types of incentives? Who's committing it and how do we think about it? Ferial?
Sure. Was this the question who has failed and how have they failed? Or is it-
Yes, no, there's another question there who said who commits these acts of corruption and why? But you can listen because they're related,
Can.
so that's fine, yes. Sorry, I just.
Like, you know, I appreciate the questions. So I was very intrigued by the question who failed and how has leadership failed. So I thought it might be useful for us to consider what didn't fail. Yeah, who didn't fail? Because I think for a school government or curriculum makers, or as you train the next generation, it may offer us a more boundless field to plow.
Right.
So the whistleblowers I'll talk about first is what in society worked for us to begin to have an X-ray into what was happening to us, because clearly something was happening.
Yeah.
And that broke was two really ordinary guys. There were two computer technicians to whom the Gupta family had taken a hard drive from Sahara Computers.
Yeah.
They were really like if you go down the road and you want to have your laptop fixed, they were those guys. They knew there was something going on, and then they saw these emails.
Right.
They took a hard drive, and then they found a way of giving it to Brian Curran, who gave it to Mark Haywood, who gave it to Daily Maverick, and then to Sunday Times.
Right.
So it's the ordinary acts of the extraordinary acts of ordinary people.
Right.
I found such a compelling story.
Yeah.
Then there was like Cynthia Stumple, finance director at SAA, and in her private life she's a yogi. We love supporting the MENA. At SAA she really stood up to what was happening by Dudu Myeni, Yaki Kwinana, and the other people whom the president had put onto these boards. At Bain, you had Athol Trollope, the man who said no. He was right in that system, and actually he was historically a Bain guy, right? And he was brave enough to say, oh, no, what you're doing here, this whitewash isn't going to work for me. There was an engineer at Transnet, Francis Keller, who just kept stopping these big deals he was being asked to sign up to. And then I think it's worth investigating is what in these people were able to enable them to stand up, and how do we encourage that?
Right.
What do we build? How do we protect whistleblowers? Every time I answered your questions here, I kept coming back to the answer isn't in government or in governance.
Right.
The answer lies in civil society and cooperation with those good people in government.
Right.
So then it was outside defend our democracy, freedom under law, Catholic. It was investigative journalism, because most of the areas which the State Capture Commission investigated, they started with works of journalism, be it the Gupta family, the Russian nuclear deal, which thank God didn't happen, the attacks on the National Treasury, the distortion of the intelligence services. So to ask who has failed and how did they fail, obviously the former president, was found to be at the center of the story of state capture.
Yeah.
And this wasn't individual. So it's not to say JZ's a bad guy and we just had a rotten apple.
Right.
In fact, it's the powers of the president. So we've invested too many, we wrote a constitution for Nelson Mandela, rather than for real people.
Interesting.
So then,
Sure.
the commission finds that Parliament failed us appallingly, that the cabinet system didn't work, that the procurement system as we had written it had failed, and that the governance of SOEs was too easily permeated by capture.
Yeah.
So how people were appointed to boards needs a lot of thinking. And then for me, the private sector just failed and failed and failed again and continues to fail. So KPMG, McKinsey, Bain, SAC, Hitachi, and then a number of smaller companies.
Yeah.
Those big global multinationals are centerpiece players in this field.
Right, right. That's very, very informative to flip the question as well and think about these people who have really been, you know, at the forefront of fighting against this. And some of the names that you've mentioned, such as Brian Perrin, I know very personally and has had a huge impact in my life. And maybe to bring you in, Gary, in the question of leadership, right? So thinking about leadership, how has leadership then failed in this issue of corruption? So taking it more than just the different individuals and the different sectors of society, when you think about leadership broadly, how has it failed?
I think we saw in the school's video before we started, President to be Mandela introducing himself to the nation as a servant leader.
Yeah.
I think that's what failed, is that his vision, his standards were not replicated after him. And so leadership is seen as power for me and mine, and it's not power to use for the benefit of others. I would just like to go back to Ferial's response.
Yes.
We think traditionally of three branches of the state in the Constitution.
Yeah.
But it was the fourth estate that saved us. The whistleblowers and the journalists, civil society and journalists. I like alliteration, so politicians, parliament, the private sector, crudely put the proletariat in the form of organized labor, I think let us down because they persisted in protecting the interests of those already employed and not looking at the interests of those who are yet to be employed.
Right.
But I think I'd like to focus on the professions, Mandela, for example, or the auditing profession. And why did they fail so badly? And I don't have an answer to that, but I do see corrective action in the auditing profession as quite dramatic.
Right.
Within a few months of the Zonda Commission's report and recommendations, they had facilitated the passage of legislation that would increase the value of the punitive fines for professional misconduct to millions of rand per individual act of this professional misconduct, which is honesty, rather than a couple of 100,000 rand. So really putting in place a serious practical disincentive. You, as an individual, will be liable for that amount of money. Not just your auditing firm, but maybe your auditing firm too. And then just earlier this month, the Judicial Matters Amendment Act was promulgated by the President. And one of those one of those carpet bag pieces of legislation, it changed one of the rules, one of the provisions of the Prevention and Combating Corrupt Activities Act. And there, private companies must, in order to protect themselves from personal liability, institute programs to prevent corruption. And I mean, one must still see, I think, that play out in practice. What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of training or systems? What's going to be required? A lot was already there in terms of guidance, in terms of King codes and that sort of thing. But clearly it was not enough. But to protect yourself from criminal liability now, you must have a preventative program in your company.
Right.
So I think there's an opportunity for the private sector to begin to renew itself.
Yes.
And perhaps begin to stop playing the role that we've seen the private sector. I think we should point this out and be explicit about this. Not just the Stellenbosch here, but local players coming from respected Western countries who are putting their fingers in the pie here and looking for extractive opportunities by massive price.
Yeah.
So we think, German companies, US companies, and I think it's maybe, there are some of them who've been held to account because of US legislation in US courts, where we've not managed to do that yet here. So there is a degree of accountability with transnational corporations that have a foot in US, for example, but it's limited, and those fines perhaps don't really match the scale of the benefit that they will be and that they obtain.
Right.
So I think there are the other thing is I think that have failed is that we Ferial was kind enough to facilitate a colloquy at the HSRC held last year, and Justice Zondo spoke about the implementation of his report, and notably he said he didn't yet see anything changing in Parliament that would prevent state capture 2.0. Right. And I think that's a concern. Parliament refused to implement a couple of important things that the Zondo Commission recommended, and they pertained to itself as an institution, and then that included more opposition members heading up portfolio committees, and I'll never spoke about. Right. And also then introducing legal protections for members of Parliament who tried to behave ethically, but if they do so at the moment, they stand to lose their position in Parliament because parties have the power of the party lists and you can be redeployed at any moment. So Parliament refused to introduce legal protections for MPs doing their job. But what Parliament did partly agree to was to explore an oversight committee for our increasingly powerful presidency. If we have a parallel or a shadow government going on in there, and nobody is overseeing the presidency, so there's another key that I think failed us, and I think because of the power imbalances within the party, that presidency has not been able to lead us to the new dawn that was promised. And we need a Parliament who is able to do that. And maybe even to back up the president if he feels his hands are tied because of the party. And of course, then we had yet another inquiry into the electoral system, recommended by the Zondo Commission inquiry. And after some delay, government has called for nominations to a panel to investigate reforms to at least a partial constituency system. So, we've had so many of these inquiries and they're just being ignored. I don't know if there's any hope for this one. Maybe Ferial's power, prophesied power reshuffle after the elections might shake things up and give us someone with an incentive to embrace a recommendation of that time. But I think for me, those are some of the key players that have failed us. But one or two that certainly haven't. And the fourth estate is the least regulated. But has been the most valuable.
Right. No, that's very important. I think highlighting the role of civil society, and I think it also answers partly the question of where leadership comes from, or good leadership within our complex system is very important. But also, Gary, you brought in the role of the private sector as well, and have brought us to where we are in terms of what the Zondo Commission has recommended. But this conversation would not be complete without us thinking a bit back, Ferial, around what the consequences have been of the capture of the state by the private sector. What consequences has that entailed in terms of the state's capacity to govern?
So thank you so much for that. So nowadays, I'm mostly spending my time working at local government level. And what I'm beginning to understand is micro state capture.
Right.
So I'll tell you how I think that looks. So, yesterday I was driving to my mom along Bayesnode Road, and there was a private security company running the speed tracking cameras. That is almost wholly illegal. I mean, the story. So now we've got electricity, which only comes on when private contractors fix the leaks.
Yeah.
So water pipes are also fixed by private contractors, and they take very long to do so in Joburg because then they get into overtime.
Right.
So what we have here is a almost near complete contract state, where services that should be performed in the public interest by public servants is done by contractors.
Right.
And I really think it's worthwhile for schools of government to begin to study this for us, because I think you'll see the same thing provincially, but not in Cape Town, where I actually have seen that in the city, at least, I may be wrong, the city itself does that work.
Right.
Whereas what you're seeing in all the other metros, and I think one of the reasons for the collapsed local state is because it's become this contract state or contract machine that only exists to give out tenders.
Yeah.
Now, it's completely unconstitutional, this kind of outsourcing and privatization of the state, but it's happening.
Sure.
It's frowned upon, but the tender system is now more than R1 trillion. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And state formation is happening around this contract system, around the tender system.
Right.
So you continue to see that. I think the Zondo Commission got to, by the judge's own admission, of it only touched the top of the iceberg. He said so, that it's happening everywhere.
Yes.
For me, as a school of government, that surely is an area to think about is as at the heart of why the state doesn't function for the people who need it most.
Sure. That's very sobering because
So, and then along with this, sorry if I can add one point. So my mom, she grew up without water in an area called Doornfontein in Johannesburg. I remember we grew up with the coal stove full of pots of water. That was like a formative vision. So then when we had water, running water, this was huge in her life.
Yeah.
She's 93 now, and she's come back to a position where there's no longer running. She get water from the borehole at the mosque across the hill. And this is what's happened because of the contract state in Johannesburg. And for me, it's like something I'm really interested in studying more. Because I think you go to the Eastern Cape, it's the same thing, Limpopo, the same thing. Everywhere where there's a flailing, dysfunctional, near failing state, this will be a contributing factor.
That's very sobering. I think just a lived reality where we have seen at some point in 1994 a sense of hope and progress and building, and now we're seeing this regression. And also
Electricity, same story.
Same story, right? And electricity has been one of the successes in South Africa, to say that electrification has broadened, but now we're seeing a reversal in the hollowing out of the state, as you say, in the formation of this contract state. But what's sobering is that this is continuing, and we are seeing it to this day as well. That's very sobering. Now, the final question, I wish that we could keep on, thinking about these different questions, but rebuilding resilience into the state, given where we are. So how do we build state resilience against rent seeking and against corruption? I think I'll start with Gary, and then I'll come to you, Ferial.
Also a brief little story. My wife was up in the Gauteng on business and driving down Mandela Drive, and suddenly no traffic lights. Because of cable theft, but also because of the lack of electricity and load shedding.
Yes.
And but there were apparently homeless people, or people who looked, I suppose, relatively poor, directing traffic.
And doing
really
it so
good
well.
And they were fascinating. Works. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah. Maybe we need to embrace informality.
Right.
And I know we're working on a project with the Department of Trade, Industry and Communication, and they are wanting to explore the provision of off-grid power for SMEs.
Yeah.
So the state is losing confidence in itself. And I think that's a concern when the state believes it cannot deliver.
Yeah.
And through our state capacity study, we've been interviewing ministers and DGs and HODs, and they all agree that the impact of state capture has been immense. But not all, I think, are in agreement about the solutions to that. But clearly, the professionalization of the public service is an important step. That's going to be a work in progress for decades. Yeah. But an important institution in that process, there are two, I suppose there are three. One would be the presidency and the premier's office, because they then will be responsible for performance monitoring of officials. So it will no longer be the minister now doing the performance assessment every year of his or her DG, but it will be the president or national minister and the premiers in the provinces. But there needs to be a moderator, and that would be the Public Service Commission. But the Public Service Commission bill in Parliament proposes expanding its mandate massively. But its budget is just going down and down like the IEC. And in the survey work that we did for the Zondo Commission, we were interviewing people about their confidence in the Zondo Commission and their confidence in whether or not its recommendations would be implemented. And we were doing it at a time when our data was showing us that we had reached a low point in trust in democracy. So the way the democratic functioning, let's put it that way. So not democracy per se, but the way democracy is working its way through people's lives. So I think there is an urgent need to make sure that the state does start delivering. But maybe it needs to be, this is another PPP iteration, the dreaded public-private partnership, but not with the big guys, but with the informal private sector. So the SMEs, those are the people who should have been empowered through PPP or triple PPP. And maybe these guys who are showing initiative, who develop their own skills, who, while they're not directing traffic, are performing artists at these intersections, and trying to earn a living in the only ways that they have an opportunity to do so. So I think we need to perhaps think about the state in several different ways and rebuilding governance in several different ways. We need our economy to be more inclusive. Doing formal channels like TVETs and skills upgrading is an important way to do it. But if we deindustrialize, that's not going to help. Resolving the problem that underlies deindustrializing, one of them is an existential challenge that faces the globe, which is climate change. But the other one really is policy uncertainty. And so the party is uncertain of what it is and who it is and what it stands for. And so we have a Ministry of Electricity and we have a Ministry of Energy and Minerals, and they're at each other's throats the entire time. And we need to find a resolution to that. So, because I think we need investors in this country, but we don't need them to be unaccountable. And I think that's the concern that comes through in what are the reasons we ask people why we have so little trust in democratic functioning, why we have such low levels that the Zondo Commission recommendation will be implemented. And it's because people don't believe in accountability, they just don't see it happening. And the future. They certainly have not seen it in the recent past,
Yes.
and they don't see prospects for improving it.
Right.
So, you know, whether it's through the courts or even through the party,
Yeah.
it's not happening.
Yeah.
Whether they're not. I mean, we were shocked to find so few people that we surveyed were even aware of the zombie future. Despite it being, you know, all over as middle class people. Most people on a nationally represented survey did not know what the zombie commission was. They had heard the name, not entirely sure how to explain it to a friend.
Yeah.
But certainly having little confidence in its ability to do anything different to what the state has already done so far. And to the extent that they were blaming the Zombie Commission for lack of prosecution, not understanding the difference between the Commission inquiry and the NPA, but also the NPA works in an ecosystem. So unless you fix the police, you're not going to, an ID and a permanent investigating directorate in the NPA is not going to fix everything. And an NPA that's not yet independent properly from accountability to the minister is not going to fix everything. So maybe we need to get to the point where the NACAC says we really need an independent corruption institution. Right. And the property capacity, etc. So I think there are a number of different strands that need to come together. That people are crying out for accountability, people are crying out for dignity. Right. And with massive inequality, I think the sense we're getting is that people don't have hope that we had in the early years of democracy. Yeah. And we need to find ways to rebuild hope. By demonstrating that shareholders are not the only important stakeholders for the private sector, and the New Light Brigade are not the only important people in government. Right.
That's very important, and I think, you know, the things that you said, bringing back accountability, that will resuscitate the hope. You know, bringing reforms at the very top in terms of leadership. We've mentioned the presidency, the premier's offices, and so forth, but also bringing those that have been marginalized over time. It's very interesting that you bring in, as an example, the informal economy, the small and medium enterprises. You know, in the literature, we call them workhorses. Their incentives are very different because they work very hard and they don't have to limit to the state, so they have to survive. And that's very interesting. Ferial, your thoughts about rebuilding resilience?
Sure. I suppose I think what we might do is look at that which withstood the forces of capture, and obviously examples of that is the SA Reserve Bank, which in fact turned all its guns on the agents of capture. I mean, they froze Gupta money long before we even knew it. Right. They used every single lever of power available to them. And it might be worth a case study to understand what in the culture of the institution allowed that to happen. Right. Ditto the National Treasury. There was very little else, as far as I can see, that was targeted, and recapture didn't succeed, sadly. So it's worth looking at those things which withstood it and what made them able to do that. Yes. And then I suppose painfully, the institution which is recovered best is SARS. Yes. Yeah. Painfully, because damn, they're taxing us. So what is the 18th letter and a few new leaders were put in there? What did they do and how did they do it so quickly? National Prosecuting Authority, less so, but worth understanding how that happened.
What do you mean by less understanding? NPA?
The NPA, because they haven't gone for any of the big dogs.
Is Batola a failure?
No, I don't think so. I don't think she's a failure. I think she's taken very long to start working. But if you see the massive increase in the rates of prosecution of rape and other forms of gendered violence, for me, that's really significant stuff. The new transparencies that you're seeing are vital. The investigating directorate, capacitation, leadership, very good. So I don't think we can call it a failure yet. I do want to understand why they haven't successfully concluded a state capture investigation, but the other changes of an institution which had truly been captured are worth understanding. And then my final one is just in Joburg, it's part of the Johannesburg Crisis Alliance, which we're really trying to work on. Is how do you establish methods of co-governance with civil society that actually work?
Right.
And where do you do that most practically and strategically?
Yes, very interesting. And then on that last point, I know Mark Haywood is actually working on that, research of thinking around that question of civil society and ways of working productively with the state as a way of rebuilding this resilience that we were talking of.
Can I add one last thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just because I'm really interested in how schools of government respond. We're heading into definitely coalition country and complex coalition country, because you could see Gauteng being governed by a coalition that's maybe ANC, EFF, some MK, etc. Whereas elsewhere it will be maybe ANC with smaller parties, and in the Western Cape, maybe even coalition might be possible here. And so then you truly will have the most complex systems of government. And how do you make cooperative governance work in such a system? For people is going to be really a significant challenge.
Absolutely, and it's such an important topic. Fortunately, we have students who are politicians, and I guess I could say right now, as a supervisor, should be precisely that question as well, because it's such an important question, and we need to understand what is possible, what kind of frameworks can we put in place, what are the incentives that are in place to make this work, and so forth. So very important question. So thank you to our speakers. I think there's much to be said and much to be discussed, but I think that it's a good time to sort of face the audience now. Apologies to people online. I've seen the comments that the audio wasn't so great, but I hope that you managed to hear at least much of what has been said. Please feel free to start asking questions. What I'll do now is that I'll ask questions from the floor first. And in the meantime, you're welcome either to raise your hand online so that we can recognize you, or you can write on the chat. I'm going to start with 3 questions on the floor, and then let's see if there will be any questions coming from our online guests. All right, so 3 questions, and I'll take it in the order that I've seen. And then, okay, 4 questions, and then we'll end with you, Professor Brian Aptopoulos. Please just say your name and then your question.
My name is Adrian Joseph. I'm a student at UCT. You mentioned the whistleblowers ordinarily taking extraordinary action. What protection going forward will there be for whistleblowers of corruption? Because, Athol Williams lives in exile today for purely safety, and Gopita de Koran was murdered. So what protection will there be for whistleblowers of corruption moving forward?
All right, thank you. We'll take the second.
My question is to Edgar Pienaar. My concern is with the NPA. Now, I heard what Ferial said. The problem with the Zondo Commission, the recommendations, my concern is that people get charged, they appear in court, and then they get information that the prosecution is not available or not able. And then those are charged. They come out and they say, you know what, my life is being destroyed and so on, and nothing has happened. So my question is that, is the prosecution, are they ready to take up, or is it going to be a failure? Yes, a failure.
We didn't get your name, sir.
I'm going to say John Doe.
Thank you. And then I think it was it you, Maria? Yes, that's Maria Camera.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks, been really fascinating. Ferial, can you do business in South Africa without engaging in corrupt practice, or at least funding the ruling party? And long history of tracking, getting the funding of political party act in place, but we know that the SASA way of doing business is business by bribery. We spend 6 million rand a month paying off people inside the prosecuting authority or inside the ruling party. I mean, the names are on the party list for this election. It's extraordinary. And then just before the election, you write a check. So there's the bribing, and then there's the let's pay. So just to comment on whether international businesses, the SARS is a case in point, Ubuntu, you know, but international businesses doing business in South Africa, is that possible to do it in a way which is not corrupt? I mean, you can see capitalism as corrupt, but that's a whole other story. Or do you have to engage in some form of political funding?
And Professor Brian,
Thanks, and thanks for two really incisive presentations. Just 4 quick comments. One is that state capture is not peculiar to South Africa. It's a post-colonial problem. And it largely takes place in a legacy where the private sector is either weak or controlled by a minority, and the state then becomes the center of accumulation for the new elite. So this is a general problem. It's important to keep that in mind. The second thing is informalization. Again, it's a global problem where massive informalization of formal economies. And then the problem is, how do you govern those informal sectors? And what often happens, ruling parties enter those informal sectors through informal structures, either paramilitary or informal structures, to influence what goes on in that private sector, especially where the monetary policy is failing at a national level, and you're dealing in foreign currency in that area, as we've seen in Zimbabwe, for example. So that informalization, informality, removes formal structures like trade unions, who are able to keep the state in some kind of accountability. And then you have informal sectors which are often penetrated by ruling party structures. The third question is, if the ANC begins to lose power and then reconfigures itself just to control so that corrupt people are not prosecuted, how does the ANC then rule in terms of its relationship between consent and coercion? You don't have a military at the center here as you do in other countries. What would be the coercive means through which the ANC would then keep people in place? Will it be through crime syndicates? How does the coercive element of ruling change within, if they're going to try and stay in power, given that the military is not at the center? And that, I think, is something we need to watch, because that then affects what happens in the informal sector and how they rule in those areas where the majority of the population are trying to earn a survival strategy.
Right.
The last point is that internationally, as we see, democratization is on the downward. It's on, and this facilitates autocracies at post-colonial stage to say to the so-called Western countries who preach democracy, who are you to talk to us about democracy when you are complicit in a genocide in the Middle East?
Yeah. Yeah.
It gives already statements are coming out from presidents here to say you can't talk to us about democracy anymore. That means they're able to legitimize increasingly authoritarian rule at national level.
Yeah.
So it's those different elements that we have to keep in mind.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that. So in the interest of time, may I ask that, Gary, you answer the first 2 questions, the protection of whistleblowers and the question of the NPA and its capacity to prosecute, and then Ferial, that's the last 2 questions before we go to the final. Yeah.
Whistleblower protection, the DOJ put out a discussion paper in July last year, which I think was quite detailed and seemed to be quite open to innovation and to be willing to, I think, institutionalize much more substantial and far-reaching protection for whistleblowers. I know that the Public Service Commission is also positioning itself as it manages the National Anti-Corruption Hotline to support whistleblowers. But they will probably need to be able to implement, and that means to be able to afford the very expensive kinds of support that whistleblowers sometimes need, such as witness protection programs, which have not been managed well at the time. So there is, I think there was a good quality discussion paper. Whether that produces the protections that are necessary is an important question. I think the other thing to note is that according to Public Service Commission stats, the number of complaints that they have received hasn't gone up. It's been declining. So does that mean that people don't trust the commission? They don't trust that they'll be safe if they report? So I think that's critical. I think that whatever institution or institutions do support whistleblowers can give practical protection so that people know I will be looked after and I'm not going to be isolated and abandoned and worse, put at risk, my family put at risk. Whether the NPA is ready to prosecute, I don't really have any insight there, but I would support Ferial in saying maybe slowly is better for the moment. Given the embarrassments experienced to date, and some of the setbacks, let's rather get the next one absolutely right. Litigation is always a bit of an open-ended game. You can't really predict. You might think you have a solid case, but a witness, for whatever reason, might change their mind, might die from natural causes. So, I mean, please, this is a moving comment. If I may just mention one thing on party funding, it was really disturbing the way in which the ANC looks like it is poised to roll back party funding regulations and the legislation, and just at a critical moment when you can expect the influx of funding. When we've seen who the funders are for the ANC, they are the mineral extractive industries. Right. And the Minister of Minerals and Energy was quite heavy to give them drilling rights, or the Minister of Environment was quite happy to consider these gas ships, car power ships, for 20 years, for heaven's sake, as an emergency measure. So I think this is a place that does need further attention. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Ferial, yeah, please go ahead. So you have the question from Dr. Maria and Camera on the can you do business in SA without engaging in corrupt practice? And then you have from Professor Brian to tell us about the post-colonial reality, the questions of informality, and the questions of the ANC losing power, how will you manage? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Those are really made me think. So, can you do business without bribing or writing a check? So, I was going to say exactly what Gary did. The ANC is running a terrible campaign at the moment. I've been out and about, and because of the Political Party Funding Act, there's been a complete quarterization of funding. So they have no posters, there are no food samples, nothing but the stuff you can buy. On the other hand, you've got income out there everywhere with swag from China. And they've obviously been planning a long time. I think there's Russian money, Diamond, Louis Liebenberg money in there. I think there's some leftover capture money from the Guptas coming through because they want the state back. And so what's the ANC's response been? The Electoral Matters Amendment Bill, which allows the president to increase the cap at which transparency happens. Because that's how the ANC has lost so much money. Anything over 100,000 rand has to be declared. And I think you're going to see that rush through because the ANC has realized how vital that the black money isn't black, dirty money is to stay in power. It's a real thing for civil society to watch and watch really carefully. So, Marianne, I've seen foreign direct investment behaving so badly across the board in the course of the state capture story that that's not my biggest concern. My great concern is that we fix this political party funding case. And I see them investing a lot in Cape Town, so it's a good question to ask Westro here. How is that happening? I think it is with transparent system so that you can watch deals all the way and a much more muscular sort of outer kind of participation in watching how that money is spent and where it goes, because we didn't have that until the end at ESCOM. And Brian, those are really fabulous insights for us to know here, because I don't think our analysis is even at that level yet. But what I'm seeing is, how does the ANC rule between consent and coercion? That there's a third phenomenon happening I'm watching on this campaign trail. And that's, I think, what you call pork barrel politics, is this complete confusion of party and state, and the direct direction of state funds, in this time 23 billion rand, suddenly making its way from the unemployment insurance fund into the campaign, onto the ground, into ANC structures. How that happens, I'm yet to work out how, but I'm yet to work out the mechanism for it, but you see that happening. Maybe I wear rose-colored spectacles, but it feels to me like coercion, like a coup here. It's going to be difficult to execute and prosecute. There was a near insurrection attempt in July 2021, and it was a combination confluence of factors that saw us fighting that way. I'm not saying it won't happen again. I think MK is certainly a party to watch for what it portends.
Yeah, thank you for those. So just to move to the online, I see Hafte, our very own Hafte, Dr. Hafte, has a question. So we'll take your question, Hafte, and then I'll move on to the comments in the chat. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. Actually, it was quite interesting presentation, and because it was a kind of dialogue, and I really like it. And I just have a question that, statistically speaking, the African Union and the African Development Bank estimated that around 140 billion USD is lost through corruption annually. And this is almost equivalent to all except 5 African countries, the GDP of just all except 5 African countries. And as you also mentioned, the whistleblowers has been targeted, the degree and the magnitude of corruption has been increased. And Marianne and I asked this question, and we need actually your contribution in this regard. So what happened to the institutions that we have created? And some of them we've created them, some of them we've been told to create them. We have different institutions, different initiatives. And what happened to the law against impunity, to our values and norms? So perhaps we might need your input in this regard so that we can incorporate to our paper, which we are working on, how we can build a resilient and democratic institutions against corruption systems in Africa. So this is the short question that I wanted to ask.
Thank you very much, Hafte. And I think, along with Professor Brian Hafte is bringing this comparative view of the continent that, we're seeing corruption and we're seeing the substance of institutions that ought to be, looking over these issues. Any comments with that, Ferial?
No, I hesitate to bring up this debate so late in our conversation, but I really think Rwanda offers us an example.
Right.
And there is just a zero, I'm not saying there isn't, but there's a zero tolerance for the kinds of corruption that we've come to accept as normal in Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, the big economies, big countries. Yes. Whereas I think there's a number of things there that firstly, the systems are transparent.
Yeah.
Secondly, people get fired and in fact prosecuted very quickly.
Yeah.
And thirdly, it brings us to this big discussion that we have is what kinds of systems help us build and develop our countries?
Right.
Are 2-term limits appropriate for our countries or not?
Yeah.
And for me, the thing I'm looking at is how do you bring the energy, principles, values of civil society into the state so that you are making changes before you have to fix a mess like we do here? I don't know if that answers.
Very important, and I think was it Talumping, I saw an analysis on Rwanda. Yeah, I think it was yesterday, and yeah, he was also reflecting on Rwanda and just saying that, you know, in 1994, South Africa was one of the countries that were very helpful to Rwanda and their situation. And now we are the ones that have to learn from Rwanda because they are getting it right. And the question was, how are we getting it wrong? Why are we getting it wrong? And why not? You know, Gary, do you have any closing thoughts?
A general one, I guess, how to build resilient institutions. People will protect institutions if they believe those institutions have their interests at heart.
Right.
So that's a bit of a less than completely useful comment. Because how does one, first of all, build those institutions?
Yes.
And how does one then protect them once they're there?
Yeah.
At the moment, we seem to be relying on the courts, but the courts can't enforce their own judgments.
Right.
So I think the institution that for me seems to have the potential to play a very significant role, and it might be biased because we're just studying the Public Service Commission, is that they are responsible for overseeing the process of professionalizing public service. Will they be given the tools and the resources to make sure that happens? Because they are supposed to convene the interview panels that will interview the people who are best in position. Will they be allowed to do that? That's what the professionalization framework proposes, adopted by Cabinet. But I think that's a very important question. Will they be allowed to do that?
Right.
Because I think that will set an example so that we don't have these ad hoc panels appointed by the president as a way he feels like it in his institution, but not that one.
Yes.
Let's have a open and transparent panel to interview candidates.
Yes.
We need to have that kind of recruitment for SOEs and for other state institutions to ameliorate the concentration of power in the president's hands.
Yes.
That a lot of the tech space behind closed doors, and the PSC is in a position to say, we can perhaps level these playing fields, introduce a degree of transparency, make sure that criteria are clear and they're adhered to in the interview, in the recruitment process as a whole.
Right, right. That's very useful. I think to just draw this conversation to a close, and I did note some of the comments. I'll still come back to those comments. Just to say that, you know, as a school, we've identified, you know, this question of governance and leadership as a very big question, and that's why we are building this. And as a school, as we said, that we are interested in becoming really one of the foremost public governance schools in the continent in terms of building robust leadership and building ethical leadership for our generations. This conversation, I think, that has been very important in really bringing out this issue of corruption and state capture so that we think a bit more analytically around it. I see that Hasmukh Gajar also raises this point of capacitating our leaders and the kinds of skills that are needed. And I think that question of capacity, of capability building is quite important. So we echo that, Hasmukh. And this conversation of leadership is continuing at the Mandela School and outside the Mandela School. So as an example, tomorrow we are hosting LB6 at the same time to continue in this leadership series of thinking about leadership. but also our partners in the School of Economics here at UCT. I see Charmaine is making the point that this evening at 6 p.m. we'll having Trevor Manuel speaking on the topic how to build and break a capable state, structural reform and institution building in the democratic era. And I think it's worth just partnering together and saying that. So thanks, Charmaine, for sharing that. So by way of closing, I want to say thank you to you, Ferial, to you, Gary, to everybody that has attended in person and online, and to just thank the leadership at the school, to thank the director of the school, and to thank the team, Penny, Dr. Marianne Kamera, Dineo, Petunia, Zikona, Hafte, Achisanam, others have left, Nimrod and Brian Raftopoulos, because we've all been coming together thinking about this. I actually saw Professor Rajan Govinda as well earlier, just thinking about this topic. We have developed a concept note, and this is our efforts of actually learning together and bringing in all the voices into the room. So we appreciate the questions, we appreciate the comments, we are taking notes. As we said, we are learning, and this is a process of being humble so that we develop new insights. And I do want to reiterate to everybody that this book,
So thank you, everybody. I consider that our refreshments, and hopefully we'll see you in the Trevor Manuel talk, but also in the LBSEX talk tomorrow as well. Thank you very much.
And well done, Dr.